All right, so let's continue on the expectation theory. Okay, so Friedman and Felt, in particular, they predicted that high inflation could not always deliver the low unemployment, right? And they were correct. Their ideas held true in the 1970s. The stagflation occurred when an economy experiences stagnant economic growth, high unemployment rate, and high price level or high inflation. So this scenario, of course, directly contradicts the theory behind the Phillips curve, right? So the United States never experienced stagflation until the 1970s, when rising unemployment did not coincide with declining inflation. And in particular, between 1973 and 1975, the United States economy posted 6 consecutive quarters of declining GDP, and at the same time tripled its inflation rate. So stagflation already contradicts what the Phillips curve is all about. So now let's look at these adaptive expectations. The adaptive expectations, one more time, right? You predict the inflation rate depending on the most recent inflation rate that you have, and then you adapt your expectation to reflect what happened in the past. But now let's take a look at a different type of expectation. This is rational expectations. So if people form expectations rationally, they use more than just the current level of inflation to predict the next period inflation, right? So the rational expectation, again, people formed expectations based upon all available information instead of just using whatever happened to the inflation rate today. So people, like I said, have incentives to form correct expectations because the errors that you expected wrong can be very harmful. The central bank the central bank inflation policies are generally not secret, right? We know they will come out and say, okay, we have the expected inflations to be within a certain range, right? 4%, 2%, and things like that. So it's not secret. And when people see that, okay, when people see that, what I'm saying that when people see that the central bank is coming out to do such monetary policy, right, they are doing it for a reason. And then people look at this reason. It's generally not a secret. People use this information to form their own expectations, right? However, the errors can still be made. Market participants can use any information when forming the inflation expectations. So these expectation errors harm somebody in the macroeconomy. So we try to do our best to predict them correctly. So this is the idea behind rational expectation theory. Errors sometimes positive, sometimes negative, as opposed to consistently being underpredicted. So basically, it's random, right? It's quite random. So the random errors rather than statistical biased errors that we're going to be seeing when we use the rational expectations. So in any case, if you expect that the Fed is going to exercise or implement the monetary policy, expansion monetary policy, you expect the inflation is going to be in place. Rational expectations then factor in all of these news and things like that. And once people already have that expectation in mind, whatever the monetary policy, expansionary monetary policy, might not have any real effect. That's what they try to say. All right, let's practice what we know. So when people have rational expectations about inflation, it means that they base their inflation predictions on all available information, right? That's a rational expectation. If you pick C, the rate of inflation from last year, that would be adaptive expectation. All right. Now, the Phillips curve, a modern view with all of these short-run Phillips curve, long run need to be adjusted, all the expectations and so on, right? So this is very important to understand a couple of things. I'm going to review the whole thing. First, it basically says you cannot exploit the relationship of the Phillips curve by trying to change the inflation rate in order to change the unemployment, right, from the short run Phillips curve. And then people will use rational expectations. They will see what the Fed is doing, and they know what the Fed is doing, and then they will change expectations accordingly. So this new Phillips curve will be formed based on these new expectations, and monetary policy won't be effective, right, if people have the rational expectation. So inflation reduces unemployment, but only if it is a surprise. We can graph a Phillips curve with inflation expectations built into it. Okay, and we're going to see this on the next couple of slides. So one more time, right, we're going to start with 0% inflation, and then we expect 0% inflation in the future. If that is the case, unemployment then equal to the natural rate of unemployment. Now, next stop, we're going to say, okay, what if the inflation rate rises from 0 to 5%? What's going to happen? Definitely, unemployment is going to fall, right? However, if people expect 5% inflation, then inflation will not reduce its unemployment. Okay? The new levels of inflation then shift the Phillips curve, and we are going to see that right away. Here we go. We're starting with short-run Phillips curves that we've done it before, and this is what it means is at initial point, at point A, inflation is 0%. Okay, and we still have the natural rate of unemployment of 5%. And then people expect 0% inflation going forward, right? So that's fine. So this means that any positive inflation will reduce the unemployment rate. Now, if the inflation boom happened to be 5%, the unemployment rate is going to fall to 3%, as indicated by the movement from A to B. But if actual inflation is 5% and expected inflation also 5%, the unemployment rate is going to move to the natural rate of unemployment at point C. Okay? Now, this is a different short-run Phillips curve, right? So we have the short-run Phillips curve 0 to short-run Phillips curve 5, right, for each of the level of expectations about inflation. This first line, expectation about inflation is 0%. The second line, expected inflation is 5%. So we have a different short-run Phillips curve for different expectations, right, of the inflation. That makes sense? This is the new modern Phillips curve. Okay. Now, that is the new long-run Phillips curves, right? So you can see that it has several short-run Phillips curves. All right. Now, if expectations are adaptive, right? So this policy reduces the unemployment rate in the short run, but eventually expectations adjust, and then the central bank has to increase inflation again just to stay ahead of the adjusting expectation. So the strategic use of monetary policy to counteract macroeconomic expansions and contraction then is the active monetary policy, right? So we used these in the 90s before expectation theory discovered. So we use the Phillips curve, and inflation during the downturns is a good thing to do. Reduce inflation during a booming economy is a good thing to do. That was we call active monetary policy. Okay, but now adaptive expectations come in. With adaptive expectation, policy reduce the unemployment rate in the short run only, right? But eventually expectation is going to adjust and is not going to have anything in the long run. But with rational expectation, the rational expectation, activist monetary policy, no gains whatsoever, right? Since the market participants will use all the variable information when forming inflation expectations. So the central bank is unlikely to get any positive result from activist monetary policy, even in the short run. No gains at all. All right, this is active monetary policy. with adaptive expectations. Might have something in the short run, but not in the long run. But with rational expectation, no gains at all. Now, if it's not active monetary policy, what if this is a passive monetary policy? What is a passive monetary policy? It is when the central banks purposely choose only to stabilize the money supply and price levels, right? Not trying to do anything with unemployment rate and the inflation rate, but try to maintain the price level. So it doesn't seek to use inflation to affect the real variables, okay? For example, the unemployment rate and the real GDP, right? So instead of looking at the unemployment rate and the real GDP, then we try to just look at the money supply and the price level. So in the United States, the Federal Reserve has moved markedly in this direction since the early 80s. Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, and other Federal Reserve chairs have consistently taken actions that lead to fewer surprises in monetary policy. So it's no fewer surprises. And the last part here is that. All right, see, we're trying to just look at the data over the long run, right? It represents a picture of inflation and unemployment rate that look random. So clearly unemployment rate is influenced by some other things as well, okay? So we can do one exercise if you wish, but let's answer the last question here. Practice what you know. What is a Phillips curve? The Phillips curve, it shows the inflation and unemployment are inversely related, okay, a B-boy. Okay, and the last one, here's a conclusion. Let me read through this one more time. Okay, the Phillips curve illustrates the short-run relationship between unemployment and inflation. Economists tried to use this relationship in the 60s with active monetary policy, right? Meaning lower inflation, higher unemployment, However, if people have rational expectations about inflation, active monetary policy may yield no results, even in the short run, okay, with the rational expectation. Now, the conclusion. Monetary policy can be expansionary or contractionary, which means either increasing or decreasing the money supply. So in the short run, monetary policy affects real GDP and unemployment, but in the long run, monetary policy affects only the price level. And then we look at the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve, right, short run, show the inverse relationship between the unemployment and inflation, but because of these rational expectations, negate the effect of the monetary policy, this active monetary policy. Okay, all right, we are done with this chapter.